are people believers in the fact that, if you get, let's say, 80% accuracy or some level of acceptance of accuracy, is that good enough to make your decisions? Or are you finding that now people are saying, no, 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 we should be able to get to 100%? Like, how deep do you go onto onto that scale?
It's interesting that you bring that up because there's always kind of in healthcare, there's a lot of individuals who like to be very precise.
Mm,
And, from a clinical perspective, that makes sense. You want
absolutely.
preciseness, right? But in the revenue cycle operations side, for instance, to identify trends and kind of see what's going on, maybe you don't need to be as precise
Right.
to be able to kind of delineate there. But
Mm,
there's still a portion of folks that want that ticked and tied at the end of the day. So you do need to get back to the hard numbers in addition to the other trends. And I think what the challenge is right now is being able to marry those two things up to tell a story that isn't making you. I liken it to when ATM cards first came out and people would take money out at the ATM, but then they would walk into the bank and then ask them to verify the transaction that they just did. So I feel like there's a lot of that going on right now.
Hi, and welcome to the Data Brew podcast. I'm Tomo Silva, and this is a podcast about how data and technology and people come together in the real business world, in the real scenarios. There's no hype, there's no buzzword bingos. I sit down with industry experts in companies, operators, founders, engineers, executives to talk about what works, what breaks, what nobody puts on the slide deck. And today I'm lucky enough to have Dan Stelljes with me of Bespoke Solutions. Dan, thank you very much for being with me.
Thanks for having me, Thelma.
Yeah, excellent. Dan, tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do, what's your passion these days?
Yeah, my background is in data management and healthcare, and compiling the composite of those two things over 30 years, from payer and provider type operations and revenue cycle, and obviously it's a very messy and complicated data stream and lots of complexity there. So wrangling that is always a challenge, and always helpful for organizations to have someone with that expertise and background to come in and help them kind of figure out the right way to analyze their data.
Excellent, thanks. Full disclosure, I know Dan for a few years. We've worked together, and I've been lucky to learn a lot from him. And I do know that he is a tremendous data analyst, expert in anything data. And Dan, we were just talking about before we started the podcast about structured and unstructured data. And I know you can't talk a lot about your projects, and I don't want you to, but you said something that was very interesting to me, which was, I always think of structured data, rows, columns kind of thing, the typical SQL tables or Excels, and then unstructured data like PDFs and Word documents and emails, right? But then you added a third component, which is some sort of a validation of kind of seeing that holistically. Tell me a little bit about that entire how you see those two things and how you come to deal with them.
Yeah, what I'm seeing a lot more is that the data, the structured data can tell you a particular story, but as we know and we've kind of discussed in the past, is you can kind of make that tell the story you want it to tell. However, when you start coupling that with unstructured data and kind of like how did we get to that endpoint? What were the inputs to that? What people because humans still touch the data at the end of the day, and so part of that component to how that data ended up where it arrived at is influenced a lot by the operations that take place and the kind of like day-to-day transactional things that you can't necessarily tease out so easily in a structured format. And then that's where I see the structured data coming into play to kind of say, hey, are we really getting, the value of our operations? If we're seeing underpayments or overpayments related to, claims payments, why are we arriving at that? Why is that such a, problem for us? What is the fix? Is there a human element to it that we need to be looking at that maybe we don't look at as closely if we're just looking at the numbers, or it takes us longer to get there because we're just looking at the numbers and not looking at the, other human side or that particular component.
Is that where you've seen the most success? I mean, you've been involved in a lot of BI projects, whether you've worked for a company for a long time, as you have, but also as you've experienced many different clients and different opportunities in your career. Have you seen like a common thread of a successful uh, data mining, data analysis project, or whatever objective you were trying to do? And how did that involve the human aspect, as you mentioning? What was the human aspect that contributed to the success or potentially to the failure of such projects?
Yeah, and a lot of what we see is that a lot of these things where there's disagreement about types of payments or things like that, things that could have been resolved much earlier in the workflow stream by people asking the right questions, and interpreting what they're getting back in response to that as to whether that is reasonable, whether that makes sense. That I find that there's a lot of instances where the data will tell you, yeah, there's an underpayment or an overpayment. But when you start looking at the history of why it took so long to finally get to that point and drilling down on that, is that, questions weren't asked, things weren't followed up on, things were just kind of left, or, people were overwhelmed with workflows. And that doesn't really get teased out necessarily in the data. You just assume that someone's not doing their job, but it may be
Mm,
for other reasons that might be related to, things that you kind of see popping up within the kind of operational portion of the data that's not as structured, that's harder to tease out, that you only find traditionally by taking a sample, looking at that sample manually, and kind of figuring out what's going on there. And what I'm seeing now is just kind of like a move towards, can we tell that story a little faster and get to the analysis faster? Maybe not necessarily tell us exactly what's going on, but get to the
hmm
analysis and trends faster than what we typically have done historically to get to that same endpoint. And then devise what remedies need to be taken to kind of make that a better process.
are people believers in the fact that if you get, let's say, 80% accuracy or some level of acceptance of accuracy, is that good enough to make your decisions? Or are you finding that now people are saying, no, 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 we should be able to get to 100%? Like, how deep do you go onto onto that scale?
It's interesting that you bring that up because there's always kind of in healthcare, there's a lot of individuals who like to be very precise.
Mm,
And from a clinical perspective, that makes sense. You want
absolutely.
preciseness, right? But in the revenue cycle operations side, for instance, to identify trends and kind of see what's going on, maybe you don't need to be as precise
Right.
to be able to kind of delineate there. But
Mm.
there's still a portion of folks that want that ticked and tied at the end of the day. So you do need to get back to the hard numbers in addition to the other trends. And I think what the challenge is right now is being able to marry those two things up to tell a story that isn't making you. I liken it to when ATM cards first came out and people would take money out at the ATM, but then they would walk into the bank and then ask them to verify the transaction that they just did. So I feel like there's a lot of that going on right now. Is that there's a little bit of distrust, with that unstructured component, and so it's how do you make that more of a trustworthy data stream, whereas they trust the hard numbers, but they may not trust necessarily as much those soft numbers, what I would refer to them as.
I am so proud of ourselves because we're already into a few minutes into this podcast and we avoided the two letters that everybody's talking about that all my podcasts have been always coming around to, but I have to bring it out now. Do you believe that it's because of that, the mistrust, or that need to kind of validate quantitatively the data is kind of emerging because of AI and how quickly AI is generating, data on our data and summaries and analysis and so forth. And, maybe people have been bitten once too many times and now they're kind of going, oh, maybe I should check this out. Or is AI contributing to solve that problem that you're kind of alluding to?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of all those things, to be quite honest. You have healthy skepticism within certain aspects, and depending on the project that you're working on, that healthy skepticism is a real good thing.
Yeah.
And so it's trying to get to a point where you can kind of remove that healthy skepticism. And what I've been thinking about recently is how do you make someone believe some of that, soft data, without overwhelming the workload just to get to that point. And as humans, we like to see things. We don't believe it until we see it, and so that's challenging when you're dealing with PDFs and Microsoft Word reports and everything. So the system has to kind of bring that to the forefront a little bit more to bring believability into play when someone who hasn't touched that data is seeing it and saying, okay, yeah, I should believe the information that's being presented to me. And that's kind of the challenge that I see right at the moment, is getting people to that point where they can trust that data.
I still don't feel, I don't know about you, but I still don't feel that, I can trust any of the GPTs that I've tested, Claude's, OpenAI's, Lishai, etc. All these, I still, I still feel that sometimes I get false positives. I think some people call it hallucinations, etc. And I've tested this several times, and things that it gave me an answer one time, which was quite precise and quite good. Asking that same question a little bit later, gave me completely different results.
Right.
And I'm concerned about kind of the models that run behind it. Is it because I moved from one model to another? Have they upgraded the models? And now kind of the logic is slightly different. How can we kind of put things around? How can we kind of, as you said, add credibility to the results we're getting when we're not really in charge of the rules in a
Right.
sense, right? Because
Yeah.
it's AI making the decisions on whether to present something or whether to pick one content over another to give you an answer. How do you have any ideas? And maybe I'm putting you on the spot, but I don't want to. Uh, is there something else other than technical, maybe process oriented, that we can put around to ensure that that is static, or at least stable, not static potentially, but stable?
Yeah, what I've started doing recently is just getting more granular and triangulating data points, versus just relying on one answer.
Mm,
So, for instance, if I noted something's related to some sort of underpayment, well, we want to know why there was an underpayment, right? Why was there an overpayment? And there may be many different reasons that contributed to that. And so, I think you do need to break it down into, and you can have the AI do this for you, but ask different questions and then take the results of
and
those
then
answers
compare.
and then
Mm,
compare and start to evaluate, does this even reasonably make sense that you're finding this information in the data, and if I have a strong correlation, then maybe, yeah, that's a good indicator that you're probably getting some good information. But if you have a weak correlation, and I think a lot of it, I'm not a statistics person, but I think a lot of it comes back to statistically or whatever, is there some sort of reasonableness around the answers that you're getting? And so I think you got to think about it in that way versus I'm just going to plug in a question and expect it to give me the right answer back.
right.
Um,
That's
if
so interesting. It's like we're doing statistics on what is already a statistically generated answer from, but this time comparing responses from potentially different models,
different
completely different
approaches,
engines, different
yeah,
approaches,
yeah.
and potentially even different prompts that you will ask to kind of obtain the same answer, but in a different angle to see if it validates what you've asked in the first place. That is really interesting. Um, of course, some people, potentially people that are using AI in the first place, would probably use AI to also validate those responses. So again, are we kind of building, who's policing who in a sense, right? Is
Right.
which AI is policing which? But that is actually a very interesting, the triangulation, that example. I love that. Um, the on the data side, and I know you did, and potentially do still a lot of work on the data side. On the app side, on the front end side, on the visualization, and what
Right,
you said before was, people need to see it to believe it. And obviously showing a table of millions of rows does nothing to the human brain, but
right.
showing a well designed graphic, with chart with proper metrics, proper scales, will do wonders, right? Um, where are we on the visualization in this entire AI world? I mean, or even in terms of, you talked about transaction. Are apps disappearing? Are front ends disappearing? Are we just going to have a chat interface and that's it? Where do you think we're headed?
Yeah, it's interesting. I've been contemplating that a lot recently because I still don't see, again, I feel, at least with the people that I work with on the ground level, is there's still the trust component that hard numbers are going to also, have to tell
Yeah,
part of the story. And what I've seen so far from a visualization perspective is, yeah, it can generate a visualization, or it can generate, a visual, but then you spend a decent amount of time going, okay, is that right? Right? How do I make sure that what it generated from a perspective, it looks nice, it looks great, and it got me there much faster to creating that graphic. But how do I know that the information tied to that was pulled in correctly and aggregated correctly? Did it make some assumptions about, somebody underlying? Did it apply
mm,
some conditions for null values, or things like that? That, us as analysts, we kind of know, oh, wait, I didn't account for nulls, or I want to exclude certain records, or whatever, or I want to filter for this, or maybe put
yeah,
two data sets together. So there's a lot there that, if it's a black box, it makes it a little bit harder to kind of trust the visualization side of it. So
right.
that's the part that I struggle with is, as I see tools kind of doing this, I still feel like you need that human interaction to be able to kind of, ground it in, some sort of reasonable,
I
hey, works.
No, absolutely. I find the entire prompting system really interesting for content, for knowledge. Um, from an analytics point of view, I've been trying. I've been trying because Click Data, we're trying to kind of build things around AI and seeing if, there is, we have reports, the PDF reports, we have the dashboards and the KPIs, and, we have live docs, we have these other things. And now we're thinking, okay, well, can we just have a chat interface? And what I find very difficult in the kind of the demos that I've been working on with the team here is kind of, oh yeah, you got me a nice chart, but now I need actually differently, something different, right? Or I want to drill down here and I have to reprompt it again. I said, okay,
Yes.
now show me this, right? And it's so much longer than just, drilling down or drilling through or, zooming in with the mouse. I find from an experience of a data analyst or even a scientist that it's so much more difficult to navigate visualization using prompts. And I think a combination of both, I think, is quite interesting. Not sure if you have any thoughts on that, but to me, the prompting thing for data analysis is great if you're asking for summaries and opinions and things on the data. But then when you get into real data analysis and graphical analysis, that's a little bit tougher, I find.
Yeah, and I liken it to, I've played around a little bit too with, like, the web builders and things like that,
Mm,
where they have AI, in, and it's great because you kind of generate something fairly quickly in a nice prototype or whatever.
yes, absolutely.
Where the challenge comes in, and I've spoken with others about this, I'm like, where the challenge starts to come in is when you start to say, okay, that's great, but now I want to change X, and what does it take for me to change X without it breaking something,
Right.
previously? Whereas, like, as when you do programming, you've got check in, check out reviews, and things like that. That I feel like there's still a lot to learn in that space. And then taking that and going to the next level and saying, okay, now I want to do the same with a visualization, where there's a lot, to me, a lot more variability in how, and you may need a lot more flexibility in the design of that visualization and the interactivity that comes with it. um, I just see it as 10 times harder, maybe 100 times
Mm,
harder from a
yeah,
visualization
absolutely.
perspective,
Absolutely. Yeah.
because I kind of know at the end of the day, like, I know the next 5 questions that I'm going to be asked are going to be, well, what about this? What about that? What about this? And it doesn't necessarily, it's hard to kind of anticipate those things from a just pure prompting perspective sometimes.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And the changing of it, to be flexible to that. You guys would know better than me, but it's got to be extremely challenging from a programming perspective.
No, it's yeah, it is. It's interesting because the more we advance in certain areas, some of these visualizations have been around for years, and I think that does not make it a reason to continue so, but by the same token, when something sticks around for a long time, that means also there's something good about it, right? And the
Right.
visualization is ultimately very key for us to understand and make decisions on, in the business world at least. So I think visualizations, to many extent, and interactive visualizations is definitely the way to go, more so than ever. Even VR helmets and these things, right? I mean, I don't think we've advanced much there. I
Right.
think potentially the last visualization that has been created is like 10 years ago, so nothing has moved in that area. But nonetheless, um, just to bring it kind of full circle back to people, because I've always said that if you teach people how to use AI can be a great tool, but teaching them those things that we just discussed, to be cautious of the responses, to triangulate the data, to validate with qualitative data, like where do we sit? Where do you feel that we are? Now you're based in the US. I think there's a large educated population of business owners, business managers, department managers. They know AI, but do you feel that they're trained and educated well enough to understand the pitfalls that AI may give them when they're using it for their own business, for their own data?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things going on that I notice is, there's some misconceptions sometimes, and so maybe not enough training. So there's training, but there's not dedicated training that I've seen so far,
Right,
from a holistic standpoint, and and there's a lot of sharing, right? So everything is kind of either word of mouth or through, hey, we have an AI spotlight going on and this
right.
is what we've used it for. And we're like, yeah, that's great. And so where I see the disconnect sometimes is, the leaders are like, oh, this should be able to move me further ahead faster, right? But maybe not understanding some of the, I mean, they do understand the risks, I believe, but I think there is great pressure to try and make use of AI more and more. And the speed at which they want to go is fairly aggressive, because AI is moving fairly aggressively. So to even stay up to date with those models, and then, am I purchasing the right contracts or whatever related to those AI models, and PHI and all those other considerations, there's a lot of moving parts right now. And
Mm,
so while I know that we're moving fast, I still feel that there's a lot more that needs to be done in terms of the education. People are definitely, what I do see is people using it to say, well, you know what? Maybe I have to use a new tool like Power Query or something like that they're not familiar with the syntax. Well, it helps them. If you know SQL, you can
yes,
usually just say, hey, this is what I want to write in SQL. Tell me in Power Query how to do the same thing,
right.
right? So it's a nice little package in relation to that, but that's not overwhelmingly increasing your productivity, maybe,
No, yeah.
and
If you don't know what you're typing, I think, if even if you do know, but you kind of, what's the syntax again? I think AI is a great, what I call basically an advanced IntelliSense, if you will,
yeah,
right? He knows how to type the stuff, and in many times he needs very little information to do so. Where I think sometimes I feel kind of a little bit, and the reason why I ask you about whether as well managers and business um, decision makers know what they're really getting into is when they say, well, we're implementing AI. And I go, okay, what exactly in AI
right.
are you talking about? Because that would be the same thing as saying, well, are you using a laptop, a PC? Yeah, but for what exactly, right? Are you doing data analysis with it? Are you just having it as a conversational chat agent for your own knowledge? Are you using for document analysis? Like, I mean, there's this AI umbrella needs to start being broken down, not necessarily into AI agents and AI orchestrators and all these new technical terms, but what exactly AI can do for you
Right.
as a business, right? And I think that that's kind of the loaded question is, are you implementing AI? That's not the right question. Is more like, are you using AI to improve your logistics or your sales in or whatever, right? We're just gonna kind of conclude. Is there any other thing you want to bring in that's interesting in terms of having a little chat now?
No, I
I
mean, this is great. I love this conversation. It's
Yeah,
always fun to, share ideas with you because I think, again, you bring a different perspective to it than I can definitely share more, obviously, with other things that I'm seeing in different tools that I'm getting access to that I was just like, oh, that's very interesting.
yeah,
That's it's data related, but it's not, necessarily visualization, BI analytics, but there's an interplay that I see between things. And I do think that you do need to break things down into smaller chunks because if you're trying to do too, too much, I think you're getting in over your skis, and that's where you start seeing the hallucinations, and that's where you start seeing, hey, I'm
absolutely.
not getting the results. Like, just because it works with this one particular scenario, making it work across a much broader spectrum of different data points
Use
or
cases, yeah, yeah,
different scenarios and use cases, that's a much harder thing to kind of validate. And I think it still takes the rigor of someone who knows, and has worked in, either the data space or the programming space or whatever. There is a rigor that should be applied to that to kind of say, we've tested it out. We've thoroughly kind of, it's another project. It's another kind of
yeah.
work stream in addition to what I think you still need your standard work streams to be interplayed with that. Because I think everyone thinks AI is the tool. And I'm like, no, AI is just one of the tools,
One of the
right?
tools.
There's
Agreed.
other tools
Agreed.
that do other things much better that may feed into AI. And then AI feeds it back. And you need to
Right.
think of it as kind of that ETL stream of, now you're taking structured and unstructured and feeding it into different streams and then feeding it back to another stream. And AI has different places within that work stream, I think. And that's just my opinion.
No, I agree absolutely. I agree, and I think that's something also that a lot of people don't kind of understand is the fact that when you do ask AI to do something as well, what they will most likely do in many cases is either write a Python app or write a SQL or a set of SQL queries to respond to your questions. So in fact, AI is using other tools, right?
Right.
So th- there's a reliance. AI does not exist out of thin air by itself. It's not just sitting on one server and that's it. And there's a lot of configuration and a lot of connectivity to other tools
Correct.
needed. And most likely, and of course, the most important one is data. Of course, data. Without data, AI will just sit there and do nothing. So, I also want to summarize thing that you put on an email to me when we were discussing about the podcast, which is, again, what you just said. It is just a tool, but what I really like is the human component that you brought into it, and specifically the training. I think social media and media. I actually just posted something on LinkedIn just today about this. It made AI such a big thing, and that's all you hear about it. That people forget that it is a tool, and just like any other tool, there's training. And I don't mean how to GPT or whatever, but training in how understanding how it's thinking and kind of rationalizing the response and what sources of data is using and what process is using for it to get you the answer that you need. And I think that training concept and the people aspect of it is still very much there to make these projects successful, whether it's technology or a data or a business project. I think the team and the training component is still kind of key to make this happen.
Yeah. I think the other component to that, Tummel, just to kind of put a fine
Yeah,
point on it, is I've been doing this for 30 years, right? And you've been doing this for a long time. There is a learned kind of subject matter expertise that comes with that, that even though you can find, resources that are, more recently into the workplace that are more advanced in maybe their AI skill sets and how AI works, what they're lacking, what I notice sometimes is that rationalization of, well, does that make sense from a business perspective, that the answer that I'm getting makes sense in relation to what I know, right?
Absolutely.
And so
Yeah.
that's the kind of challenge that I see with AI is because if you go so fast and you have the brain drain on the back end, that you still need people who are there to go, wait, I'm going to question that because it's right to question that. I use AI like an intern, right? Go off and do, this set of tasks for me, and then I'm going to judge whether that seems to be accurate or not.
Yeah.
So there's a certain amount of, again, healthy skepticism with all of it to take
Yeah,
it in.
yeah, absolutely. No, I
Yeah,
think experience, absolutely. Now, this is interesting. Well, we were talking about that recently with, I think it was Dan Valentino, and we are talking about how the expert or the more senior developers are becoming more like validators of the work done by the AI agents or by the junior developers that are using AI to build code.
right.
And my question to him is, well, assuming that the senior developers, are willing to do that work, um, where's the next wave of senior developers? Where are they going to get their experience? Because the junior developers are not getting the experience. They're using AI. That's not gaining experience. You gain experience by doing it, by implementing it, by experiencing it firsthand. And so where I'm seeing is there may come a time where there's a gap of expertise. Here I'm playing to the old folks like myself and yourself, right? But I'm concerned about that gap of experience and expertise that may come because AI is aiding so much the new generation of analysts, of developers, of pretty much even writers, content writers, marketing, that did not have to kind of build the stuff themselves, and now they're kind of, well, they have the necessary experience and qualifications to validate the next generation of people. So that is very interesting that you mentioned that in a different angle, but still. Dan, thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate it. Love our talks as always. Thanks as well to everyone that is listening to this podcast. I hope it added some value to your work, to your daily life. I'm always happy to hear back from you guys with comments. Just send me an email, telmo.silva@clickdata.com. If you want to be a guest, sorry, not a host, that's me. And until next time, this is the Data Brew Podcast. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you, Tomo.